I think sex is our aliveness. Eroticism is life force. And when we separate these two things out and we make part of ourselves wrong and bad, we've taken away something that is our birthright. Every cell in your body is wired for pleasure.
Welcome, Jaiya. She is a certified award-winning somatic sexologist, author, and founder of the Erotic Blueprint Breakthrough. You may recognize her from the Netflix series Sex, Love, and Goop, where she joins Gwyneth Paltrow and a team of experts to help couples enhance their relationships through more pleasurable sex and deeper intimacy. Her book, Your Blueprint for Pleasure, shows readers what it means to have a sexual awakening by taking them on a journey of deep self and sexual realization by helping readers determine their erotic blueprint type. Think your love language for the bedroom. Sensual, energetic, sexual, kinky, and shapeshifter. Jaiya guides them to uncover their superpowers for a more fulfilling life in and out of the bedroom. Today, Jaiya helps men, women, and couples learn more about their sexuality so they can create more lasting passion, deeper connection, and experience ultimate pleasure in all areas of their life. Hey, I'm welcoming Jaiya to the show. Welcome to Passion, Love, Pursuit. I'm so happy to have you on and go into this juicy conversation with you, which I know it will be nothing short of that.
Juicy. I love it. Thank you so much for having me and for having this conversation, because I think it takes courage and vulnerability to talk about a topic that in our culture is so taboo and something that we don't often talk about.
Isn't that so true? As I was kind of telling you offline, like I'm an open book. I'm very vulnerable and I have no problem being vulnerable. But this is kind of like what we'll go in today will be vulnerable, and it will obviously get people excited, curious, and really intrigued to kind of look deeper into this conversation that we're going to go into. So first, so I don't know if people are familiar with you, the people that are tuning in, but I discovered you when I watched the show on Netflix. I believe it was in 2021. It was called Sex, Love, and Goop with Gwyneth Paltrow on Netflix. And it was a wildly popular show. I just remember I went into your the whole series that you did. And I was just fascinated by the things I witnessed and your expertise and your passion for what you do. And so people that have not yet to see that, of course, I'm going to plug it in the show notes because I think we could revert back to that, look at it, see your work in action, and deepen our curiosity. And then, of course, everything else you share today. But can you tell people what exactly is a somatic sexologist, and how did you land in this type of work, of course?
So a somatic sexologist is someone who looks at sexuality not just from the brain and from talking about our emotions. We're really looking at the whole picture of educating people about what's true for them in their own bodies. So I, as a sex therapist, might just talk about, sit and talk to you about things, give you things to do at home. I actually work with, okay, well, wait a minute, your breath just stopped. Let's see what's happening. Why did your breath stop? What's there? Was that an emotion? Was that something else going on? And so I'm looking at more of a whole picture and then going, okay, how does this pleasure feel in your body? Now let's take it into the body, because sex is something that happens in the body. It happens in the mind too, but sex is something that definitely happens within our body. So we're somatic means body-based. We're looking at it from a body-based point of view, not just from a psychological point of view, and has much more of a holistic mindset. Now, how did I get into this? I joke all the time. When I was a little kid, it started then. I was the kid who was like, let me tell you where babies really come from, to all of my friends, and was completely fascinated by Dr. Ruth. And I wanted to be Dr. Ruth when I grew up. And I told my parents I wanted to go into fertility medicine just to be on the safe side, because I grew up Roman Catholic. But telling your parents I want to teach people about sex in that world was a little bit taboo. And so not just a little bit, it was a lot taboo. And so fertility medicine or being in medicine seemed like something I could say that I wanted to do. but secretly, I really wanted to just help people with their sex lives.
That's the thing is I think this conversation is like talking about sex. It's so much more prominent today. And I've had a lot of conversations on this podcast with Layla Martin, BB, gosh, a few others on sex. And I feel it's coming up so much more today. And obviously there's lots of conversations with sexuality and whatnot. So what do you think has been like the needle mover in how things have transitioned? Because you've been doing this for over 30 years, if I'm correct. And I imagine when people first came to you, it was probably in shame, in secrecy, maybe curiosity. So how has it really shifted, and what has been the needle mover, do you think, in society today?
I think one of the things has just been feminine empowerment. I think that more women are taking their sexuality in their own hands. They become curious about it. We've risen together in many, many ways, and the sexual wellness industry is slated to be, a $3.2 billion industry. I think I had heard. And so just there are so many women who are really leading the charge and saying, I get to have my pleasure. I
Mm.
get to have sex worth wanting, as Esther Perel says. We have to have sex worth wanting. So what does that look like? We're curious. We want sex education. I think we're having not a revolution, but an evolution of our sexuality. I think there is part of it is a revolution, but in revolution, there's a revolt. I think more we're looking at like, how are we elevating ourselves? How are we evolving as sexual beings? And in my 30 years, I've seen such a shift
I can
in the
imagine.
conversation. I remember my very first book, when my first book came out, they told me I'd never be on media. I'd never ever talk about the clitoris, or I'd never say any of these words, and I'd never ever really get my message out there. And then over the years, I've been on CBS daytime television talking about female ejaculation. And it's like every year there's like a little chip, and it becomes even more of a conversation. And so I think the Sex, Love, and Goop show, that was another big, like, oh my gosh, we're really having this conversation. But then at the same time, we become really polarized. And so there's also backlash against some of this empowerment and things that have shifted and changed. And so like the day Sex, Love, and Goop came out, our entire business got shut down. We got cyber hacked. We got like our email provider dropped us, like, because we used the word pleasure in an email. And so like I'm not putting like porn stuff out there or anything. Like that's not what our emails are. It's just like we just talk about pleasure. And so there's still this fear of sexuality and a lumping of like, oh, well, if you're talking about sex, then it must be pornography, or, all the new laws around sex trafficking, which of course nobody wants sex trafficking in the world. But then other people who are doing really great work kind of get lumped into all of it. And there's a lot of shutdown, and it's really hard to still do business. And I wish that would change. I feel like I'm a phoenix, like I get burned down so many times. We've been shut
Rising.
down, taken down, and I'm just like, all right, here we go. We're rising again. We're rising from the ashes.
Yeah, and I think so many of you are now speaking towards this. So I think when it comes like a bigger group comes together and rising together, I think it makes it like at least more impactful and being able to be heard. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's so important, because I know a lot of people have shame. They believe, have grown up in this taboo around sex because of religion, or, just their upbringing and their family system or whatnot. So it's definitely a conversation that needs to be had for sure. And why do you think so many people have really shut down their sexuality in general, like even today in today's world?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a number of factors that contribute to that. One big one being, what was your upbringing that's been passed down generationally? So, did your parents have shame around sex? What were their belief systems around sex? What were you being taught around sex? A lot of people say they didn't get a sex education, but I argue that you did get a sex education. You've been getting it from the moment you were born, about your messages about your body, messages about your own agency around touch. If you've been told, no, no, go hug grandma when you don't want to hug grandma, like those messages of even like, oh, I have to override myself right there. We're getting a message about sexuality and in our own agency. And so I think part of it, stems from generations of shame. The Victorian era, especially here in the United States, we were founded on puritanical ideas. And so, you know, how do we escape religious trauma and sex negativity, even in the medical community? I don't think any of us really escape some kind of sexual trauma in our history. If it's a bad, our very first gynecological exam, or,
Right.
um, you know, uh, uh, we go to have sex and we don't know what we're doing and we get harmed in some way. And so because there's so much stigma, it just perpetuates it. And then that trauma gets carried down through many, many generations. So there's a lot to unravel for those of us who go on this journey of sexual healing and awakening. There's just a lot to peel back and uneducate ourselves and re-educate ourselves.
I love how you say that, uneducate, like unlearn those things that we've learned so that we could now take in the knowledge that's actually right and true. That, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we came into the world because of sex. I mean, unless you did IVF, but still, regardless, mostly it's through sex. So it's like sexual health is such an important thing that I think that, one of the things you talk about is sexual health is like really optimal health. Like that's one true sign of health. So if you could talk a little bit more on the sexual aspect, why should we not ignore this and instead focus more on it? And what could we do like immediately to kind of look at our sexual health? Like what is if you want to say the top three things we should look at to kind of address our sexual health, like really start to look at it instead of looking away?
Mm-hmm. I think so. The why. Why do we want to look at our sexual health? I think what's important here is how our sexual health is tied into our longevity, how it's tied into our happiness and well being, and how our sexual health are also indicators for other things going haywire in our bodies. So if we're not paying attention to that, we're just like, oh, my sexual function isn't so great. So what? I'm getting older. We start to like kind of shove it under the rug instead of going, wait a minute, sex hormones equal youth. They're our youth. So how do we stay optimized? How do we stay well? By generating more of those juicy hormones, by telling our bodies we're still sexually active. When our body goes, oh, we're not sexually active anymore. We don't need to reproduce. We don't need to be part of that anymore. So then let's now degrade. We start to send our body different messages when we're having our O vitamin every day, when we're having orgasm every day. We're stimulating our immune system. We're stimulating youthfulness. We're stimulating aliveness. We're actually helping our brain too create neurogenesis with orgasm. And so there's so many facets that are just on the physical health layer, but then there's also connection with another human being.
Of course.
There's how we regulate each other just through touch. There's love and how we're expressing love through sexuality. There's being fed with pleasure in life. Life is so much more enjoyable when we're not running away from pain and instead we're living a life of pleasure, when we're putting pleasure first. That fuels everything. I mean, for me, it fuels my business to be in pleasure, to have pleasure first before I'm going to get on an interview like this and feel that aliveness. It just makes, I think sex is our aliveness. Eroticism is life force. And when we separate these two things out and we make part of ourselves wrong and bad, we've taken away something that is our birthright. Every cell in your body is wired for pleasure.
Mm.
So
And I
then
know
where do
that's
we
your
begin?
main,
Oh,
and
go
that's
ahead.
your main focus is how could you bring more pleasure to people's lives? And that's why you have your newest book, The Blueprint for Pleasure, which of course
Mm-hmm.
we'll go into that. But one thing I love that you bring up is longevity. As you know, that's a really hot topic right now. And how often is sex talked about in longevity? But you had a very good point when you're saying our hormones are actually our youthfulness, because of course, like as we get older, especially for women, are, we start to lose estrogen and we go into menopause and all these things change. So yes, hormones are our youthfulness. And so is it proven that having orgasms actually increases our longevity? Has there been studies on that?
Yeah, there have been studies. I don't know how they do these studies because the way that they word them is kind of funny. Well, they'll say something like, men who are having sex into their older age don't die. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? Like, Okay, so like they're less likely to die. I guess like younger. I'm not sure how that all is phrased. But then I was working with a doctor, and I was asking him, tell me about longevity, because he was very pro sex. And he's like, it's really interesting. My patients who have cancer, there are some of them who stay very sexually active through the process, and there's some of them who don't. And what I've noticed, what he had observed, was the patients who had stayed active with their partner, who had in some way kept that aliveness and that the practice of sexuality and connection going, they got better. And so he was like, I really want to do research on this. I don't think he ever did, but that was one of the things that really sparked me around what is out there, what kind of research is out there. And I think there are a couple of things that contribute to longevity with this. One is having a partner who's seeing your naked body, can see things like, oh, there's a growth on your back, or there's something weird going on. So we catch things earlier because we have somebody in our life who's seeing something maybe where we can't see.
Mm.
And that is one indicator. There's also the youth hormones and immune system boosting. So there have been studies that show that having orgasm regularly boosts the immune system and helps us then not to get so sick and take as many sick days. So there are some studies out there, but we need a lot more studies in sexuality. Again, all the shame and stigma, people don't want to research.
Right. Sorry, by the way, if you hear a dog crying in the background, I don't know. Do you hear that? Because he's crying like crazy right now.
I heard a little bit.
Okay, I'm like wondering
He's
if I
like, oh, there's a conversation about sex happening in there. I want in.
yeah, weird on Monday too, funny enough. Talking about sex. But hopefully, calm down. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's interesting because since the topic with longevity is such a hot topic right now, and so many more research papers are coming out of, what produces longevity, I feel like there's going to be a lot more with sex and optimal sexual health and orgasms.
Mhm.
And, since these topics are so important these days, I think it will be coming up more. Uh, so talking about your book, so the 5 erotic types. And what I love about this, as I was kind of mentioning offline, it's absolutely brilliant because, as we all know, one of the most popular books of all time is it Gary Chapman's? Yeah, Gary Chapman's 5 love languages. I think everybody has pretty much taken that test. If you have not, by the way, of course, take that test because it's so, so useful. But most importantly, your test actually, which is the 5 erotic types, the blueprint for pleasure. Over 2 million people have taken your test, your quiz. And of course, this will be in the show notes. You could choose to, take the test, pause this episode and continue on, or just take it after you finish this episode. But this test, it's a quiz. I took it when I watched your show on Netflix, and I took the free one. So the free one, you could discover your main erotic type. And then if you take the low paid one, you could discover the percentages of all your erotic types. So anyways, going into this, I would love to know, first of all, how did you discover these 5 erotic types?
So, in my practice, being a somatic sexologist, I spend a lot of time with people who have libido discrepancy or a whole lot of differences in their sexuality. So, but they don't understand, because I think we live in a standard narrative of sex. And this is the way that we're supposed to be, which is only one blueprint. And so, through my practice with couples coming in and getting to work with them in arousal, I started to just notice patterns. And then the other thing that was happening in my own life at the time, I had a new baby, and I thought that was a big contributing factor, which it was, but my partner and I were not having great sex. So I was this, sex goddess sexologist, and I wasn't having great sex at the time. And a lot of it was because my own partner and I felt very mismatched. I would come to bed and I would touch his genitals, or I'd say, let's have sex, or I was trying striptease classes, and nothing was working. And he'd come to bed and cuddle, and I'd roll my eyeballs thinking, oh my God, he's cuddling again. And it was because we were different blueprint types. And so it came out of me trying to solve my own problems of not having the sex life I craved, but also watching so many of my clients feeling like they were sexually incompatible or that they had some kind of mismatch. And like you, I love the 5 love languages. I love the Enneagram. I love the disc profile, like all these different personality typing tests because it helped me understand who I was
Yeah.
and then who other people were so I could communicate better, honor who they were. And so I thought there has to be some kind of system for eroticism out there. And that's when I started to just notice these patterns. And then I was like, oh, this gives us a language. This actually can help us communicate who we are in what I was noticing and through my practice.
So remarkable. And I think that's great. Obviously, you've spent, decades studying your industry and also sex and somatic healing and whatnot. So it's interesting how you were just noticing the patterns and then it shows up in your own life and you're questioning
Mm-hmm.
why is this happening. And I think what's so fascinating, of course, these 5 erotic types, it's number one to understand yourself more and also your
Mm-hmm.
partner. And I think a common thing, I imagine, tell me if this is common, people come to you wondering like, we're not sexually compatible. Like, does that mean, it's over
We're
for us,
doomed,
or what do you
right?
do? Or, and so what is your experience with that? And is that like a death sentence if you don't feel compatible with your apartment or your partner?
Not at all. You are not doomed. You're not broken. I actually think that sexual incompatibility is a bit of a myth. And the reason why I say that is because I think it comes down to learning skills and it comes down to willingness. So are you willing to learn your partner's language? Are you willing to learn your partner's blueprint? If you're not willing, then that's a problem. But if you are willing, then just like learning a language, if your partner speaks French and you love them, and they love speaking French, learn to speak French. It's that really that easy. It's just like learning a language. So if you're willing to learn, then you're not doomed at all. And actually you have superpowers. Some, different blueprint typings together have superpowers. And I actually think we're trying to complete ourselves into a more full spectrum wholeness in our sexuality. And so that's why we often attract an opposite, what seems like an opposite or what seems like a mismatch in our sexuality is because there's a part of ourselves we've tucked away. There's a part of ourselves that we've locked, behind hidden doors. And our partner often has that part.
I love actually that you pull that out because I feel like in partnership in general, we have it's almost like we have a partner that teaches us the things that we needed to learn. And I think in that sexuality and eroticism is one of those things as well. I love that to look at it as like a positive thing that, oh, just maybe this is like something you need to look at. And maybe this is something to explore so that you could expand your
Mm-hmm.
sexuality and your passion and pleasure. So I love that. So let's go into the 5. If you could kind of walk us through them. I know that there's the type and then there is also the shadow side. So if you could kind of walk through some of them and I'll ask some questions along the way.
Great. The first one's the energetic, and that's someone who's turned on by anticipation, space, tease, longing, yearning. So if you're someone who's like, oh, I'm so turned on before we kiss, it's in the anticipation before something happens, you may be an energetic. Your superpower is that you can have orgasms without being touched. You can go into expanded states of consciousness during sex and explore all like mysticism and all of these different realms. Tantra, some of these things might be something that you're attracted to. On the shadow side, the energetic is someone who short circuits really easily. They're so sensitive that if you go too much, too quick, too fast, then you're going to have a shutdown and maybe even dissociation from the body. Oftentimes, there's some kind of trauma in the history of someone who's energetic. And that's why they develop the superpower of being so sensitive, is
Mm.
because they've heightened their awareness. The next one's the sensual, and the sensual is someone who's turned on by all of their senses being ignited. So that's touch, taste, smell, a beautiful sight. They bring the beauty to eroticism. So in their superpower, they're going to bring the candles and they're going to have all the romance and the beautiful contexts of sex. And they can also have sex that or have orgasms that are non-genital. So this might be like behind the knee or the neck, somewhere that is not a primary erogenous area where their turn on lies. The shadow side of the sensual is getting caught up in your head. So you're like thinking about the to-do list and the laundry that didn't get done, or your partner's breath or something like that, which is then turning you off or putting inhibition on your turn on. And so the sensual can also get like a mess, and they get so caught up in all of it that they lose the pleasure that their whole body can experience. They
So
also
they're
need to
more,
relax before they can have sex.
and so they're more in their head sometimes because of their environment.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, they get caught in their head because of environment, because of things to do, because of stress levels. They're the least likely, like when they're stressed, it's very hard for them to toggle or transition into an erotic realm because they definitely their mind spins, or they get hyper vigilant in their nervous system and they don't know how to calm down that hypervigilance.
Yeah. Okay. And then the next one would be,
The sexual. And the sexual is someone who's turned on by what we think of as sex in our culture: nudity, penetration, orgasms, getting to the climax, very much what our standard narrative is. And Ian Kerner, he's a brilliant sex therapist, he talks about sex scripts. And I think that the standard sex script that most of us have is okay, we kiss, then we do some foreplay, and then we have intercourse, and then we're done. Climax, and then we're done. And what's fascinating is that's just one out of many, many, many different sex scripts. There's we don't even have to have intercourse. And so that's the shadow side of the sexual. There's this limited definition of sex, which is that script. And if we fall outside of that script, then maybe something's wrong or it seems abnormal to them. Like, wait a minute, well, what's wrong with all of you who have a different script than I do? And that's because it's our cultural narrative of that script. And so I often hear out of sexuals' mouths where, well, we're having orgasms. What's wrong? We're having penetration. Like, what's wrong? Why would we want anything else?
does the sexual always need the end climax, or generally?
Often, oftentimes they want the certainty that they're going to have penetration and that there's going to be this end climax, because to them, opposite of the sensual, they love sex in order to relax. So if
Mm,
they're feeling stressed, they may be like, oh, sex then helps me feel like everything's good in the world. Sex helps me down regulate. So sex helps me feel like you love me. And so the sexual connection it isn't just, I think sometimes people say like, oh, sex is just this want that we can have on the side. But I really, for a sexual, it is food, air, water. It's something that we need. And I like to argue with it's not just a want, because we wouldn't be here. Human beings wouldn't be on the planet if we didn't have sex.
right.
So it is something that we fundamentally need. We need that connection.
Yep. And then we have or sorry, two more. We have
The
kinky.
kinky. So the kinky is someone who's turned on by the taboo. So this is whatever is taboo for you. There's psychological kinky, which means you love the power dynamic, maybe giving over or surrendering power, or it's something that's happening more as fantasy in your mind. And then the sensation based, which means that maybe you love impact play, something like spanking, or the feeling of ropes or constriction around your body, so that you're having this sensation. Some people are both of those. And then the superpowers, I mean, I feel like you could explore endlessly. There's so much creativity in the realm of kink and so many gadgets and toys and things to play with within this realm. And because we've created sex as a taboo, I think it's part of all of us. We all have this aspect of like that little thing that's naughty, that little thing that
Right.
feels, like I shouldn't be doing that. The
Right.
superpower is similar to an energetic. You can have orgasms that come from just the stimulation of your mind, or you can go into these states like subspace or dom space. You can have an experience that doesn't have to involve your genitals at all, that is highly arousing and highly fulfilling.
Okay, so a question when it comes to kinky. So I imagine, or also I know from reading your book, there's a lot of shame that comes with the kinky erotic type. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
just curious, in your experience and the knowledge you have, does kinky like taboo I'm trying to get the word I'm looking for. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking. But the kinkiness, is it does it come from some sort of, something that happened in somebody's past, maybe trauma, or, you know, something that has affected them, that's why they're into this certain thing?
Hmm. That's a really interesting question, and it's something that people have studied and explored, and they find that there is no more trauma than anybody else in within people who identify as kinky. And as a matter of fact, they're often better at communicating their needs and their desires and creativity in the bedroom. So there isn't a correlation more than, let's say, other people in terms of trauma or why someone is like that. My partner Ian is kinky, and he was always asking, like, did something happen to me? Why am I like this? Why do I like this? And he doesn't have any history that would say, okay, well, this is why you've been wired this way. This is why your eroticism is this way. It's just the way that he developed. And
I
so,
think
that
that's
was an interesting thing in our own relationship. Was I was zero kinky and he was highest in kinky on the
wow.
quiz. So that was part of our mismatch.
Right. I think it's important to bring this up because anybody that's listening that likes some kinky thing, that we need to understand, like, there's no reason to have shame around it, that,
Hmm.
like, to not question, like, am I, like, weird, or is there something wrong with me for liking this? But then instead, like, embracing it and communicating it to your partner, of course, and also setting boundaries, having conversations like what's okay. And I know you talk a lot about this, is that consent piece. And I think, with all the blueprints, I think it's having the conversation with your partner or whoever you're with, and talking about consent, especially when it comes to, I think, the kinky things, maybe,
Hmm.
more sexual things and whatnot, because there's lines that somebody doesn't feel comfortable crossing. So, what would be your advice on that to kind of soften the conversations, if you want to say?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here when we're talking about the shadow side of kink, which can be I'm ashamed. And then also the shadow side of because I'm ashamed, I don't get education and I don't talk about these conversations around consent and what's going to keep me safe. And so it's something that I think no matter who you are, no matter how long you've been in a relationship, when people come to see me, no matter how long they've been in a relationship, one of the first things we do is we have a consent conversation. What are things that you want to explore? What are your hard limits? What are the things that are absolutely no way am I doing this activity? And then what are the things that I'm willing to try? What are things that are no for now, but maybe as I learn more might be something that we try later on? And we're having those conversations before we ever start getting into sex. And the reason being is once you get into sex and you start getting into higher arousal, you're drunk. It would be like having a consent conversation when you are completely not sober. And so, we want you to be sober. So before we even start, we're having that conversation. And it doesn't matter how long you've been in a relationship with someone. I still have consent conversations every time I am with partner and I've been with my partners very long term. My Ian, who I've been talking about, we've been together for 16 years and we'll still have a little like, what do you want to try tonight? What's off limits? How are you feeling? What do we want to play with? Because
Mhm.
sex doesn't have to be intercourse all the time. And sometimes that's hot. We take that off the table. And then it's like, oh, now we have to get creative about all kinds of other things that we want to play with or other blueprints we want to play in. Right now, we're exploring a lot of energetic.
Mhm.
And that's really fun because he's really expanding even more into his energetic, which he was 5% energetic on the quiz and zero sexual on the quiz. And I was mostly sexual energetic and I was 5% sensual, zero kinky, and he's a sensual kinky.
Okay, so, well, let's get into the last one, the shapeshifter, and then we'll go deeper into this.
So the shapeshifter is someone who's all of the types that I just talked about. So if you're like, oh, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, I was a little bit of all of those, then you're probably a shapeshifter. And the superpower of the shapeshifter is that you can shapeshift to please anybody. So if your partner's a sensual, you can shapeshift and speak sensual. You can speak French. If your partner's kinky, then you can shapeshift to that. But the problem with that, the shadow side of that, is that because you're so erotically intelligent and sophisticated, you're often starving because it's hard to find other people who have that full spectrum sexuality and who have really developed and cultivated fully into that. And so, and then the interesting thing about shapeshifters is I actually think we're all shapeshifters. And I
Mm.
think that we just cut off pieces of ourselves. And then that's why our blueprint actually shows us where we're limited unless we fully developed into our shapeshifter and really owned our shapeshifter, because these are all just aspects of a full spectrum sexuality. And so then we tuck something away and then we're not fully developed in it. And so as people go through this work, they become shapeshifters oftentimes because then they start to incorporate and expand into all these blueprints.
That's so great to know. And that's what I was actually wondering is like when somebody finds out, let's say their main, their highest in sexual and then their, lowest is sensual, let's say, can they then develop these in partnership or even in self pleasure practices? Can they then learn these other languages, if you want to say,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe it shifts different times in our life and evolves? Yeah.
100%. Yeah,
That's,
yeah. I mean, what I've seen is sexuality is not static. It shifts and does change and grow, and we do evolve. And I think that's an important thing to recognize. Like, if you have a baby, your blueprint might change. You get a new partner, your blueprint might change. You go through menopause, your blueprint might change. If any big life event may affect your sexuality. And so I think that's something that's important. When you meet somebody new, we often have more sexual blueprint right off the bat. And then
mm,
that fades just because of
mhm.
biochemistry, how biochemistry is affecting things. And so this will shift. And then how are you navigating that, I think is important. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you obviously swiped over all the types, but of course, in your book, your Blueprint for Pleasure, you go really deep into it. And also the practices to go explore it a little bit more and understand yourself and your partner or your sexual partner more through reading this book. And then, of course, doing the quiz to find out your percentages of each erotic type. So, everybody, of course, that will be in the show notes. So, get the book to go deeper into it once you learn your type, take the quiz, learn your type, and buy the book and go deeper into it. But the one thing I'm wondering is when we do have these, as you said, mismatches, or as some people might think, incompatibilities, then what? So, let's say, I'm sexual and my partner's sensual. I'm not sure what, I guess before I ask that, in your quiz, over 2 million people have taken it, or in your experience of decades working with people, is there a commonality that the men camp and the women camp, or is it kind of just really diverse and there's not a more than others?
Yeah, I think this is fascinating because I think we have assumptions gender wise of like, oh, all women are this or all men are this. So then we offer advice based upon thinking that. And what we saw with the people who've taken the quiz is that most people who identify as cisgendered heterosexual women are energetic and then sensual. And so I find that fascinating because we rarely talk about energetic. All the sex tips and tools that are out there are rarely energetic. So we have this huge population of people who just aren't being served because there's a lack of education at all around how to play with them. And then for people who identify as cisgendered heterosexual men, that is mostly what we think sexual, right? We're like, oh, men are sexual. That's all they think about is sex. And we've really done a disservice with some of these ideas, genderized ideas, because across the board, it's not that men are primarily sexual. They're actually really close around all the blueprints, not just the sexual blueprint. So that was really surprising, when we looked at the data of everybody who'd taken the quiz, that we saw that, because I think the assumption is all women are sensual, all men are sexual, and that's where things would primarily fall. But we don't. I think we're a lot more than just those two.
So it's pretty evenly spread across the board. There's not any specific camp that people generally go into, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
when somebody has with their partner a mismatch, how do we then address that with our partner and be able to learn their language? Like, what would be a process of doing this? Or even if you are, because I know you address, like, you don't need to be in partnership to explore your pleasure blueprint type.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say when there is a mismatch, or, you just feel like you're not really compatible with your partner?
Yeah, a couple places to start. So once you know your blueprint and you know your partner's blueprint, then I think it's important we have 4 steps of this process. If there's a mismatch or just if you're wanting to explore on your own, the first thing is how do you get fed in your blueprint? So how are you resourcing yourself first so that you can feed your partner in their blueprint? And I think a lot of people don't go into really getting themselves resourced in their own self pleasure. Most of us think we have to self pleasure in the sexual blueprint. So, how are you energetically feeding yourself? How are you sensually feeding yourself so that you feel fed? That's the first step. Then, how are you learning now your partner's blueprint? And so, this goes into speaking the blueprint. So if your partner has a blueprint that's closer to your secondary, if you're looking at percentages, then that's going to be easy, low hanging fruit because you already have some access to that. My
Mm.
partner and I didn't because we were completely flipped. But I was like, okay, I need to learn how to speak kinky now. I need to learn how to feed him here because I'm speaking sexual all the time to him, which he's 0. So that of course isn't turning him on. So how do I speak the language of kinky? It's the words that I use. That's one part of it, but it's also body language. It's also skill set of, let me lay out the red rope on the bed instead of saying, I want to have sex tonight. Red rope on the bed. Now he's interested. Now he's turned on because I've learned how to speak his language and honor him where he is. So that's the second step.
Mm.
The third step is healing the shadow aspects of the blueprint. So your own blueprint, what are the shadow aspects that are showing up and healing those. And there's more than just what I mentioned here that are in the book. So look at those and which ones are affecting you because they're putting the brakes on your sexuality.
Mm.
And is your partner doing their own healing on healing the shadow aspects of the blueprint? So there's this healing aspect to it. And that could look like psyche emotional healing, like healing the charges or the shame, or, how do I stay present instead of floating off thinking of my to-do list? How do I actually stay with my partner? These are some of the things that we mentioned, but what needs to be healed? And then the last piece is how do you expand? And what expanding means is that now my partner's blueprint isn't just something I'm performing or doing because I'm trying to turn them on. Now my partner's blueprint has become my turn on too. And
Mm.
so there's always a Venn diagram where the two of you can dance, where you find that place. Like, for example, with my partner's kinky and my energetic, he wanted me to beg for sex. And I was like, I'm a sexual, I don't beg for sex. Like, I don't have kinky. I was 0 kinky, remember? And the way that he found access to that was he would tease me and tease me and tease me energetically until I couldn't stand it anymore. And then I'd be like, no, now I want the sex. And so he wouldn't give it to me. And he would just keep teasing me energetically once he learned how to speak energetic. Or the opposite way, because I didn't have kinky and I wanted my sexual fed because my sexual was so starving. He gave me permission that for 24 hours, I owned his genitals. And so I could boss him around. And that was such a turn on for him because now we had a power dynamic. Now we had kinky in there. And I could demand that he could do sexual acts to me, or I got to do sexual acts to him because I owned his genitals and his orgasms.
That's remarkable. I love how you kind of walk through your experience with it. And I think that's so great. It's basically exploration, like exploring, knowing their language. It's, again, reverting back to, people are familiar with it, the love languages. Once you know what feeds them, what makes them feel love, and you speak in that language, then it's like, and then you meet each other in that. And I think that's beautiful. And I know you have so many practices in your book, which is really great. And you just shared great examples, like just throwing a red rope onto the bed. You're like, there we go. That's so amazing. I love that. Like simple things that people wouldn't think of. But I think
Mhm.
the key thing here is a lot of people don't even know this really exists, that this is why they're not having compatibility with their partner. So I think that's why this is so important. And I'm so happy that you have this book. out to the world now that's available to order, and then also just, taking the quiz and just understanding yourself and your partner more, which is so brilliant. So the other thing I was wondering, is there maybe the most common compatibility or mismatches, if you want to know, like, or different types that are most compatible to work with each other?
Well, what's interesting is I think that each pairing has superpowers and also has shadows, just like each blueprint. So, you put two sexuals together, they're going to be hot. They're going to burn really bright. They're going to like have a really quick fire. But then how are you creating longevity when, let's say, somebody's sick or
Mm,
injured, or you lose sexual function as you age, or something like that happens? Then now they need to broaden into other blueprints in order to create longevity in the relationship. Or the shadow is, I'm always going for that hot sexual attraction. And maybe that relationship isn't healthy for me. Maybe that pairing isn't the healthiest for me because I'm always going for the sexual attraction and maybe not the great relationship that could be being created. And so each pairing, no matter who you're with, has these powers and these incompatibilities. Now, in my practice, what I see the most is this incompatibility problem between the sexual and the energetic.
mm,
And I'm saying incompatibility problem, but I don't really believe it's an incompatibility again. Like, it's just
right.
that it's a perceived incompatibility of like, oh, I'm super sexual. I want sex all the time. I want it to be very physical. And the energetic is like, no, don't touch me. All my eroticism is in the tease and the turn on. So how do we bridge? And that's really the thing, is as long as you're in the conversation of, let's get curious, let's get creative, let's see how we can bridge. Let's see how we can integrate. Let's see, why energetic does the sexual hold so much charge for you? Is it because you've overrode your own body for so long that now it just feels like your partner's mauling you all the time and you really want to be seen and acknowledged as a human being and not just as a sex object? What is it that's the charge that's there? And can we then work with that charge so that we can clear some of the limiting beliefs or some of the feelings that have been built up, or the armoring that's been built up on your body because you always feel like you're being bombarded because of the level of sensitivity? And sexual, then, okay, what's your charge around? Okay, you're getting pouty because your partner is saying no. Now you're like, wait a minute, my needs. I'm married to you. You need to give me sex. Well, okay, wait a minute. There's a whole lot to unravel there in some of that sort of toxic sexual, that really the shadow, another shadow of the sexual.
How about tools that will help increase pleasure in general? Like, what do you feel is, I know you talk a lot about breath, so maybe that's a tool, but what would you say is critical to be able to be more in your pleasure, to have orgasms, to be able to connect with your partner? What do you feel is like the most important tools necessary?
I think that the number one tool, if I could teach anybody to do anything, and this sounds so simple and yet it's so hard for so many of us to do, is awareness, is presence, being right here with our partner in the now. And most of us have such a hard time doing that. We're so focused on where we're going or what we needed to do. And that's part of that sensual shadow. But also, I think it shows up across the board, is that we don't really know how to just be with something for a long extended part of amount of time. So a simple exercise that I love to do is put on a song, and can you stay present to that entire song, to one little part of your partner's body? Maybe it's this little bone on the wrist, and for the whole song you stay present with feeling every little nook and cranny and temperature and what's happening underneath your fingertips and what's happening with their breath and your breath as that song plays. And what I often say with couples to do is, the moment you lose presence, you have to start the song over again.
Mm.
And you have to keep doing it until you get through an entire song with complete presence with one another and really feeling one another. Whoever's the giver, whoever's the receiver, it doesn't matter. If you're the receiver, how does your partner's fingertip feel as they're tracing that bone for that whole song? So just take one little part of the body and and play a song and stay in presence. And that's a way to just start to practice this until then you can start to extend it to your entire time that you're lovemaking, where you're fully present with your partner. And even as arousal gets higher, you don't lose presence.
That is such a great exercise. I mean, it really is pushing you to be like testing yourself, like how long can you stay present? I feel that's a
Mhm.
tantra practice. Is that a tantra practice something? Because I know it's very much like being present, looking at each other and like in the moment. Is that a tantra?
Mhm. Yeah, part of my background being in Tantra, I learned a lot about just coming into the present moment through Tantra, through breath, through eye gaze, through a lot of different exercises that they do to bring you into the moment. Because that's a big piece. When you're in the moment, then you start to experience self and you start to experience more pleasure, more ecstasy. But I think one of the real reasons why we come into the present moment is to realize that there is only this eternal moment, and time stops when you're in this eternal moment.
Oh gosh, so many more people need to be present. So I think that's an exercise we should just do in general to like strengthen our ability to be present. I love that.
Hmm.
What would you say, what would be your advice for couples that possibly, the sex has kind of died out? What would be like your advice to help bring them back to intimate time with each other?
Hmm. Well, besides knowing who you are, so that you know how to talk to each other and know how to honor each other, know your blueprints. One of my favorite exercises is a dyad. And it's just starting to have the conversation, because I think for couples who haven't had sex for a long time, just talking about sex is awkward. Touching each other again is awkward. It just feels very awkward. And I feel like we don't feel like we're understood. And so this exercise is just one to help people feel like they're more understood. And it's just a prompt. It's not a conversation. You just go back and forth with the same prompt, which is, tell me something you want me to understand about you and sexuality. And you're not looking to agree, you're not looking to put your own insights in or anything like that. You simply say thank you and then you switch. Tell me something you want me to understand about you and sexuality, so that you're starting to understand each other. And you could do this for 40 minutes. To me, this
Mm.
is great foreplay. I do this with my partners regularly, of just like, I want to understand them where they're at right now, because sexuality changes, like we talked about. And so just start the conversation and seek to understand each other and where you're at. And then you might do another prompt that's like, tell me something you'd like to try together. After you've understood each other, then you start to get ideas and write all those ideas. What's something you want to try together? And then circle the ones you both want to try,
I
and then
love
go from there. Maybe that's just cuddling. Maybe that's, let's take a class on energetic sex, or you're kinky. I never knew you were kinky our whole marriage, but let's like go take a rope class together and start to learn together how to feed you.
That's so great. I love that. Such a great exercise. I think anybody should try that. I think even if you're not having too much sex in your relationship or whatnot, I think you should still do that exercise because it's just deepen your knowing about your partner. I'm so sorry for my dog crying. I hope you don't hear it. But the other thing that you mentioned in your book that I was really intrigued by, you call body mapping. Can you touch on that a little bit? Because I think this is really good for also the people that possibly don't have a partner.
Yeah. So body mapping is when you're actually making a map of pleasure in your body. And so this is, again, like being a somatic sexologist, these are the kinds of exercises and things that we do, because it's like, okay, there's information in the body. And I think that's an important piece if you're going to body map or you're going to practice any of the things that are in the book, to remember that it's all just information. It's it's not that you're doing something right or wrong. I think a lot of times we try something, we think we did it wrong, and then we don't try anymore, and we give up that exploration around sexuality. And so with body mapping, you're going through the body. And my favorite way is to do a scale of 1 to 5. On a scale of 1 to 5, how pleasurable is this? 0 being, don't, hate that, don't want to do that, stop, don't ever do it again. And then 5 being, oh my God, that's orgasmic. And so if we're on this scale, and let's just say you're touching your partner's elbow. And so you're there and you're touching your partner's elbow, maybe doing light little circles with your fingertip. And then you ask them, on a scale of 1 to 5, how pleasurable is this?
Mm.
And then they can give you the exact number of how pleasurable that is. And you can start to go through the entire body then just mapping them from head to toe. Usually I take 3 hours anytime a new client comes in, or, I just want to map myself because I've gone through some kind of change or something in my body and I'm curious about myself. I'll take 3 hours and go through and create a map. And then I think what's important is don't get stuck on the map. Like, don't get stuck like, oh my God, their elbow was a 5. That may change. So, it's something that's ongoing because our arousal and our sexuality do change, but it's good to have a map.
That's so great. I love that. And again, I think that you could do that with yourself in self pleasure, like just
Mm-hmm.
kind of, explore your own
No
map.
partner required.
Yeah, that's what I love. I mean, I think your whole book kind of walks through whether you have a partner or not. These are the things you could try. I love all this. This is so juicy. So, so good. And like I said, there's so much more you go into detail that people could try immediately and explore themselves more, get to know their sexuality more, maybe unlock parts of themselves that they've suppressed uh,
Mm-hmm.
for a long time now. So just awaken your pleasure. Like you said, like be pleasurable in everything in your life. And so it's juicy. I love it. I love it. I love it. So I just want to ask you one last question that I ask all my guests. And that is, if you were to share a piece of wisdom, a life lesson that you've learned along your journey, and you just feel it's something you need to shout out to the world, what would that piece of wisdom be?
Hmm. The thing that I frequently want to shout out to the world is that I think we go through life feeling like something's missing and we don't really know how to love ourselves. And we try to fill it with so many other things, be it sex, be it money, be it success, whatever those things are. And the end to that seeking, the end to that trying to fill those things is the direct experience of who you really are. And when you realize who you really are, you can't help but love yourself. And so the end game is unconditional love for you, from you. And when you have that unconditional love for you, from you, where there's nothing that you need to be, do, or have to be loved because you love you, then everybody around you gets it. You become a rising tide and everybody gets love.
Oh my gosh, that was so beautiful. Thank you, Jaya. I love that.
Mm.
I wasn't expecting that from you. That was such a beautiful message and such a great way to close off. I absolutely love that message. Thank you so much. This has been such an honor. I've been wanting to have you on since 2021. And so I think this is the
Mm.
perfect time considering you just released your book about
So
these
perfect.
erotic types. So I'm just thankful for you and everything you're doing today. And you're really just opening the doors and getting people more curious about their own
Mm.
sexuality and exploring their own pleasure with themselves and others. So
Mm.
thank you for all that you're doing. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And just where could people best find you, by the way?
Jaiya.love is my website. So it's JAIYA.com. Or sorry, .love, not .com. .love. Jaiya.com, I think, is a Thai restaurant. So don't go there.
I love it. Great. Been an honor. So appreciate you. Thank you again.
Thank you.